Leadership is not a position. Leadership is a behavior. You also can't self-designate. You can't call yourself a leader. That's like calling yourself good-looking or funny.
That's Rich Diviney, retired Navy SEAL commander and the best-selling author of The Attributes, 25 Hidden Drivers of Optimal Performance.
Other people decide whether or not you are someone they want to follow, and they do so based on the way you behave, and these behaviors stem from these elemental attributes.
I'm Michael Mogul, founder and CEO of CRISP, the nation's #1 law firm growth company. I've built my business through practice, not theory. CRISP started with just $500 to my name and has grown to over 8 figures in revenue over the last few years, earning a spot on the Inc. 500 list of the fastest growing private companies in America. Our approach has been to take everything we've learned about generating massive growth within our own organization and help the country's most ambitious and committed law firm owners do the same for theirs. In each episode of this podcast, I sit down with innovative market leaders from the legal industry and beyond to learn from those who thrive in the face of adversity, challenge the status quo, and define what it means to be a true game changer. I sat down with Rich Diviney to discuss the difference between peak performance and optimal performance, why courage cannot exist in the absence of fear, and how to cultivate a culture of resilience and perseverance in your law firm.
So if there's someone who has a genuine interest in developing a specific attribute for their role, you can totally develop that. Our brains are plastic. Neuroplasticity is a real thing, and we can definitely learn and develop this way.
That's coming up on the Game Changing Attorney podcast. Before we begin today's episode, I want to remind you that we aren't beholden to any sponsors or run any ads on this podcast. This allows us to present all of our episodes raw and unfiltered. I'm not going to push any made-to-order meal services on you or try to save you any money on your car insurance. That being said, I have one small request. If you receive any value from this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. Pay the fee so we can keep this podcast free. All right, Rich, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Man, so I know we got a lot to talk about. Very excited to talk about the attributes, the book, just everything that you've been up to. But I guess just to kick things off, I'd love to hear about just your experience as a Navy SEAL and how it led you to writing the book.
Yeah, that's great. I went into the SEAL teams in the mid-'90s. So I graduated Purdue University and went ROTC and then went straight to SEAL training in the 90s, 96. Very few people had heard about SEAL. SEALs were not the popular entity that they are today. But I really wanted to try something that was that I thought was unique and difficult. I went straight to SEAL training. Interesting, SEAL training, it's about a 90%, it's a 6-month course down at San Diego, and it's about a 90% attrition rate. And so like our class started with 170 and we graduated 38, if I'm correct. I say that not to necessarily impress, but really to impress upon people that that's really when my journey began in terms of self-reflection, because I immediately felt what I have now since called a positive imposter syndrome. All right. In other words, how am I still here? When I look around me at all these superstars, what is it about me that allowed me to get through? And what is it about us, this unique small group that allows us to do what we do? And so that was pervasive throughout my career in terms of wanting to get into and study performance. And of course, after 9/11, the world got very kinetic. Our world certainly got kinetic, and we began to deploy and actually go to combat and do what we had trained to do. And so it was a very interesting, dynamic, wonderful in some cases, horrible in other cases, journey. But in all cases, I felt like, as an officer and as a leader, whether it was leading a troop, whether it was commanding a team, whether it was running training and selection, I felt like it was really an opportunity to learn and grow, and really kind of jot down these ideas of what I was experiencing in terms of what it takes to be a high-performing individual, what it takes to be a high-performing team, and then, of course, how to translate that and articulate that in a way that's relatable to everybody else. Because another aside is we had no clue that we'd rise in popularity. I mean, no one knew who we were really, and then suddenly we're on this freight train of becoming the most famous unit in the world. It was bizarre. It really was. But went through my career and ended up retiring in 2017 and getting into leadership space, writing the book. Meanwhile, that entire time, I met my wife back in 2000. We got married pretty quickly. And we've been together ever since, raised 2 boys. They're teenagers now. So yeah, I'm very grateful to have done it and grateful that it's over.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm just curious, what was the goal behind distilling all these insights in a book and, getting this information out there? I will say it seems like anytime I speak with anyone who comes from the SEAL teams, like there's just this innate degree of like credibility where if they're going to talk about anything to do with leadership, and perhaps that has to do with just the adversity and the various types of situations that you find yourself in, but it's attributable and applicable ultimately to areas outside of the SEAL teams.
It is. And I think that's really what fascinates me. Again, I know so many SEALs. I'm friends with most of the guys who are out there speaking about it, Jocko and Goggins and so on and so forth. And I love most of what everybody's doing. What I endeavored to do was really try to talk about concepts that while we could use the SEAL, I could use the SEAL credibility, say, hey, here's why you should listen to me. But it fairly immediately took SEALs off the pedestal and made it very human. That's what the attributes does. It was a way to look at performance in our world, but also say, hey, this is a human thing. This is not a Navy SEAL thing. It's not a super athlete thing. It's not a super business thing. This is a human thing. And I've always been interested and fascinated in trying to draw those lessons and distinctions in a way that people can relate. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been able to go around the country, go around the world and talk to people, because yes, the SEAL stuff's cool, but as soon as you get into it, as you know, it's immediately not about SEALs anymore. It's about you and your team. And that really drives me. I love that. I love that idea. So
now, when it comes to the attributes as you describe them, like how would you define it and how would you differentiate it from skills or personality traits? Like what makes an attribute stand on its own?
Yeah. Attributes are basically the quality traits that tell us if we have what it takes to do the job, not if we know how to do the job, if we have what it takes, or do the thing, right? Not just the job, right? And so what I recognized when I was running selection and assessment is that we needed a better way to articulate what we were seeing when guys were not making it through. And it wasn't as easy as the guy wasn't a great shot or the guy couldn't skydive. It was more complex than that. And that's when I really started to dive into these things. So to give you an idea, and just to give you a sense of what I mean by that, a quick story, and this was relayed to me by an older SEAL that happened before I came in. But the story goes, this guy was an instructor. The story goes, this kid showed up one day to SEAL training and walked into the instructor's offices and said, I want to be a Navy SEAL. And the instructor said, okay, you have to do a swim test. And the kid said, fine. And so they took him out to the pool. It was an easy swim test. 25 meters to one end, 25 meters back to the other end. But the kid gets all ready and he jumps in the pool. And as soon as he gets in the water, he sinks to the bottom of the pool. And he starts walking across the bottom of the pool to one end. And he touches that side and he walks across the bottom of the pool back to the other end. And he comes up and he's gasping for air. The instructor looks at him and says, what the hell are you doing? And the kid, who's still trying to catch his breath, looks at the instructor and says, I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim. And at that point, the instructor pauses and he looks at the kid and says, that's okay, we can teach you how to swim. And the idea is, why did the instructor say that? The instructor said that because he knew if this kid had the qualities, the attributes inside of him to show up to Navy SEAL training and he didn't know how to swim, he had everything inside of him to be a Navy SEAL. Teaching him to swim was going to be the easy part. And so the difference, real quick, skills are not inherent to our nature. We're not born with the ability to throw a ball or ride a bike or shoot a gun. We're trained or taught to do those things. Skills direct our behavior in known and specific environments. Here's how and when to throw a ball, ride a bike, or shoot a gun. And then because skills are very visible, they're very easy to assess, measure, and test. You can put scores around them. You can put statistics around them. You can put them on resumes, which is why we get seduced by them, especially when we're hiring or picking teams or performance evaluating. What skills don't tell us is how we're going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty, because in an unknown environment, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to apply a known skill. And so this is when we lean on attributes. Attributes, on the other hand, are inherent to our nature. All of us are born with levels of adaptability, perseverance, discipline, situational awareness. Now, we can certainly develop those things over time and experience, yes, but you can see levels of this stuff in very small children. If you have kids or have experienced kids, you will agree with me when I say there are 1.5-year-olds who are patient and there are 1.5-year-olds who are impatient. There's a nurture-nature element to attributes. Attributes don't direct behavior. Attributes inform behavior. They tell us how we're going to show up. So my son's levels of perseverance and resilience informed the way he showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike, and he was falling off a dozen times doing so. And then finally, because they're difficult to see, they're very difficult to assess, measure, and test. They show up the most visibly and viscerally during times of stress, challenge, uncertainty. Even though they're present all the time, they're the most visible and visceral. And so this is exactly why, if we're not talking about attributes in any performance picture, we're missing a huge part of the performance picture, because we're missing the part that defines performance when things don't go as planned. And that's a huge distinction between a regular team or a regular person and a high-performing team or a high-performing person. The high-performing team, high-performing person, they can perform not only when things are going great, but also when things aren't going great. Attributes tell us how we're going to do that.
And then you distilled down, I believe it's like 25 of these things, and we don't have to go through every single one, but maybe we can cover at least the categories or the 5 categories that they fall into.
Yeah. I wrote the book and the book came out in 2021 and I knew there were more. I just kept it to 25. Now we work with 41 and I know you took the assessment. You took the assessment and you have 41 attributes and 9 categories. But yeah, I think the book categories are a good summary. In the book, we have grit, drive, mental acuity, leadership, and team ability. Those are the categories. And the attributes aren't exclusive to each category, right? Even though courage is in the grit category, one could make a great argument for why courage is needed in leadership, right? So they cross contexts very, very easily. It was just an easy way to bin. But grit is a great example. Grit is a category. A lot of people think of grit as a singular thing, as an attribute itself, and it's actually not. Grit is a combination of things blended and catalyzed and stewed together to create the result that is grit. And the attributes that do that are courage, adaptability, perseverance, and resilience. And we can go into any one of these, but the mental acuity ones are the way our brain processes the world: situational awareness, compartmentalization, task switching, and learnability. The drive attributes, what are the attributes that make up the driven person? We have self-efficacy, we have discipline, we have narcissism. And then we have the leadership attributes. So, and again, what we have to talk about leadership is not a position. Leadership is a behavior. I always joke, you also can't self-designate. You can't call yourself a leader. That's like calling yourself good looking or funny. Other people decide whether or not you are someone they want to follow, and they do so based on the way you behave. And these behaviors stem from these elemental attributes. Those attributes are empathy, selflessness, authenticity, decisiveness, and accountability. And then finally, team ability, our ability to work in teams. Again, we don't get to call ourselves great teammates. Other people decide whether or not we're great teammates based on these behaviors, these attributes. And those are integrity, humility, conscientiousness, and insouciance. And so you have several more, and I'm happy to dive into any one of those. But these are the distinctive things. And one thing I will say before if we want to dive into any of these, just for the audience, everybody needs to understand that all of us have all of these attributes. We all have all of them. The difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each, right? So if we take adaptability, for example, and our Likert scale, 7 is high and 0 is, or 1 is low. And I would probably be a level 6. I think I'm a level 6 on adaptability, which means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy. It's very easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it, right? Someone else might be a level 3. The same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them to go with the flow. There's stress, there's challenge there, but they're still adaptable because all human beings are. So if we're going to line up these attributes on a wall like dimmer switches, all of us would have different dimmer switch settings, and that starts to speak to our own unique individual performance in whatever endeavor we're in. And that's when we really start to get a sense of who we are and how we operate at our most raw.
I'd love to ask, just, I'm sure people hear certain attributes, they're like, man, I know I have this one, or I like to have this one. Just in your experience working with business leaders and even just leaders even outside of business, have you seen any commonalities of particular attributes amongst the most successful as compared to the least successful?
Well, it's a great question, and the answer is not necessarily. I would say, well, let me answer in 2 ways. First of all, I don't have enough data yet to be able to make some distinct and objective opinions or factual statements about how, say, most CEOs show up, right? But even in that, what's interesting is that the list often varies, right? So in other words, the list of attributes that's required to be a great Navy SEAL is going to look different than the list of attributes that's required to be a great lawyer or a great surgeon or a great teacher, right? So while I do think that in the leadership, in the CEO realm, there probably are some commonalities. When you talk about great CEOs, we haven't really been able to distill that just yet. I think after we get more and more data, we should. However, I will say, and this is I remember reading about, I think it was the top 20 entrepreneurs in history, okay? And every single one of them was high on narcissism. Every single one, right? So you start to recognize, oh, wait a second, that makes sense based on what narcissism is. We can get into that because I know it's an attribute and I know sometimes people think it's pejorative. It's very niche centric in terms of what you're into. And that's where it becomes very interesting.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned that it's easier to develop skills than attributes, but how does somebody go about developing attributes?
You can do it, you just can't do it the same way as skill. And what I'll first say is that if anybody wants to determine whether or not they're dealing with an attribute or a skill, all I have to do is answer or ask a very simple question. And that is, can I teach it or can it be taught, right? If the answer is yes, it's probably a skill. If the answer is no, it's probably an attribute. So you could say, Rich, I want to learn how to shoot a pistol and hit a bullseye, right? I could take you to the range and teach you how to do that within 2 hours. Okay, that's a skill. Or you could say, Rich, I want to be more patient. I can't teach you to do that, right? So to develop an attribute takes, if you're low on it, takes three things. First, it takes the knowledge that you're low. Okay, that's number one. Second, it takes the desire or need to develop it. What do I mean by that? I mean that just because you're low on an attribute doesn't necessarily mean you need to develop it. In fact, being low it might be exactly what you need, and developing it might be detrimental to what you're trying to do. I always kind of joke, the stand-up comic with too much empathy is going to be a lousy stand-up comic. Okay, so it's really about, okay, am I low? Then will developing it help me in my specific niche? And then if those two answers are yes, the third one is the most important. You have to seek and find environments that test and tease and develop that attribute. So if you want to develop your patience, for example, you can say you can find environments that test and tease your patience. Whatever that is for you. You could drive deliberately in traffic or pick the longest line in the grocery store to stand. And I always say have kids. Having kids.
Just have kids. That's what I was going to say.
So you would hope that but you can do that with any attribute you're low on, as long as those three criteria exist.
Speaking of environment, I know you mentioned this plays a critical role in even developing certain attributes. How can leaders create the types of environments that bring out the best in their teams?
Well, the idea is first leaders need to understand what attributes are required for their specific environment. So some of the work we do, because I took it from what we did in the SEAL teams, is we help teams and organizations understand what attributes their culture requires. Because every culture is different, and every culture, based on their values and the behaviors that stem from those values, are going to have this list of attributes. What are the most important attributes for this culture? So that's the first thing. We have to understand what the culture requires. And then obviously it's good to be able to see and assess everybody's levels of attributes. This is why we generated the assessment tool. We created that because understanding where people are at is great. And then at that point, it's a matter of understanding, okay, in each specific role, is the person effectively aligned in a meaningful way with the attributes that they're high on? And honestly, that can almost be done fairly simply, because if someone is feeling miserable and stressed and they don't like what they're doing every day, it's likely that they are not aligned, And I always kind of say, I like to think of us as all automobiles, okay? Humans are like automobiles, except, some of us are Jeeps, some of us are Ferraris, and some of us are SUVs, all right? And there's no judgment there, because the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do, and the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do. But we have to lift our hood and figure out what we're running with, right? Because we might be a Jeep that's been trying to run on a Ferrari track this whole time, or a Ferrari that's been trying to run on a Jeep track. And understanding our attributes allows us to understand if that's the case. And so what it allows leaders to do is look at teams and say, okay, if I have low performance in certain areas, it may not require firing people, or certainly might not require judging them as people who can't cut it, right? It might simply be because that person's attributes aren't necessarily aligned. And if we put them somewhere else, their performance now begins to skyrocket. And then it allows us then to also realistically look at our gaps and say, okay, based on our gaps, now I know exactly what I need to go out and bring into the team based on attributes. So that's the real power. It really helps people have a deep understanding of their culture and the performance.
Yeah. How likely is it that somebody who is, let's say, weak in a particular area, or an attribute that a leader believes that the business needs, right, or that that is necessary for a specific type of role? Well, let's say you have a team member that's low in that particular area. How likely is it that can be developed, or it can be developed into, I guess, the type of level where it can actually make a meaningful difference?
I think it's consistent with how much the person wants to develop that. You can't force someone to develop it, right? So if there's someone who has a genuine interest in developing a specific attribute for their role, you can totally develop that. Our brains are plastic, right? Neuroplasticity is a real thing, and we can definitely learn and develop this way. Obviously, the younger we are, the more plastic we are. So development at younger ages is way faster. It's why we actually we've been doing work with schools, middle schools and high schools. And then the work we do is not about labeling the kids and saying, oh, you're high and low on this. It's really about informing them about attributes, so that they understand that and they know, hey, if you actually feel like you're low on something, man, this is the time to develop it, because your brains are sponges right now. So our plasticity obviously starts to go down as we age, but it never goes down fully. So anybody can do it if there's a true desire and motivation, but we just have to know as leaders, we can't force that. The person has to have that own internal drive.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what we talk about is just the importance of like courage and looking at it from the standpoint of, courageous leaders act in spite of fear, right? They're willing to make investments, they're willing to take more risks. And we see a lot of really successful leaders that are courageous. But then when you look at somebody who, let's say, is not as courageous, who wants to be more courageous, what insights would you apply there? Because is it just a muscle that you strengthen through basically acting in spite of fear over time, and then you build confidence and you continue to do that and build, or is it something else?
Yeah, the quick answer is yes, but I'll give more than that because it's a neurological thing. And courage is a great attribute to talk about because courage as an attribute can be misunderstood, has the potential of being misunderstood. When we are stressed or challenged in any way, or there's uncertainty in the environment, our autonomic arousal begins to rise in our autonomic nervous system. Our amygdala, our threat detector, goes up, and fear begins to become present. As soon as that happens, our brain gives us two choices, either fight or flight. We've all heard those two choices. Now, we've also heard freeze, but they've discovered that freeze is really just an oscillation between the two. You're just deciding which one to do, right? But there's two specific and individual unique switches in the brain, one for fight, one for flight, okay? If you choose fight, i.e. step into your fear, your brain gives you a dopamine reward for that, right? You get rewarded for stepping into your fear, okay? This is why when we do something that scares us, we feel so good afterwards, okay? So what this means is courage, it means a couple really important things. And we've heard this philosophically, but it's neurologically true that courage cannot exist in the absence of fear.
Yeah.
If you don't have that fear bubbling up, you don't have access to that courage switch. So when we talk about courage as an attribute means how often and consistently does someone step into their discomfort and fear, okay? Which means that there can be a generally anxious person out there who is high on courage because every day, every minute, they are stepping into their discomfort. Meanwhile, you can have a group of Navy SEALs in a gunfight with Al-Qaeda, and they are literally experiencing less fear in that moment than the 8-year-old you just asked to step in front of their classroom and introduce himself. So we don't judge, the attribute's not judged based on what you do for a living. When it comes to practicing that, all we need to do is we need to basically try to find things that make us uncomfortable and step into them more often. But do it very deliberately, and do it in a way that you can register that dopamine reward, register how good it feels, okay? Now, there are going to be some endeavors that are just harder, and I would also say that some endeavors may atrophy over time, and one of them is height. So I don't like heights. I've never liked heights. You've read the book, you know that. So skydiving was never really that fun for me, but one of the things I used to do when I was still in the teams, just to help inoculate my fear of heights, is we had obstacle courses at every SEAL base, and so that's just obstacles you climb over. On every obstacle course, there was what's called a cargo net. It was a 65-foot net that you basically climb up to the top, you throw yourself over the top, and then you climb down the other side. So I'd always time my runs or plan my runs to go past that net, and I'd always just get on the net and I'd climb to the top of the net, and I'd sit there, and I'd just breathe in the fear because it was really fear. It just felt fearful, and then I'd come back down, and it felt good after doing it. But as I did that over and over again, I began to feel less and less fear. And when you do that, the dopamine reward starts to decrease, right? Why do I say that? Is because if I went 6 months and I hadn't done that, I would feel fear again going up that net, right? So there are going to be some things that scare us that it's going to be hard to atrophy, but I think we can all generate and develop a habit of stepping into our discomfort. And it doesn't have to be skydiving every time. It doesn't have to be climbing mountains every time. It could be having a conversation, striking up a conversation with someone. So I think all of us have the ability to start doing those little things that make us uncomfortable, doing them, stepping into it, feeling that register of reward and saying, okay, I did that. And that's the muscle that I think anybody can grow.
And I guess even diving further into that, so when somebody is faced with fear and they want to actually step into that and be courageous, but there's something that stops them, is it due to a lack of commitment, or is it perhaps the delta, or whatever's in front of them is too much of a challenge and they need to kind of start with something smaller first?
It might be either. However, I'll give you a distinction that might help with this. And one of my good friends is a guy named Andrew Huberman, Dr. Andrew Huberman. He has a great podcast. He and I have been friends for several years, way before the podcast. And so he and I have done a lot of work together. When we first met, we were doing a lot of work together on fear. And one of the things we looked at and realized and recognized is that fear is actually a combination of two things, okay? Fear is a combination of anxiety plus uncertainty. And the idea is you can have one or the other, and you don't necessarily have fear. You can be anxious but not uncertain, okay? That'd be like I have to give a presentation next week. I'm a little bit anxious because I haven't given it before, but I know the people, I know the presentation, so there's no real uncertainty I'm going to. So there's not really fear. There's just a little bit of anxiety. You can be uncertain without being anxious. That's every kid on Christmas Eve. No fear there. You combine the two, you start to get that fear response, okay? So one of the things we can do is in a moment where we're feeling fear, we can ask ourselves, what is the uncertainty and what am I anxious about? You can, in fact, buy down one or the other or both in many cases so that you actually decrease your fear and you can actually step in a little bit further. So you can buy down anxiety just through internal mechanisms. You can breathe in a way that reduces anxiety. Psychological sighs, CO2 blowout breathing, even visual tools can actually bring down your autonomic arousal, bring down anxiety. So you can buy down anxiety internally. You can, in some cases, buy down uncertainty. That's a little bit more difficult because you're talking about an external environment, but you can do that just by asking questions about our environment, right? Okay, wait a second. What do I know about this environment? What can I control? Once you start to do that, you start to focus in on something that you can know and control, and you begin to, in some cases, or at least in small increments, buy down uncertainty. And so I think part of the process is this ability to generate logical thinking. And this also is a hack, right? Because what happens is when our autonomic arousal goes up, our amygdala gets tickled, we get to a point where our frontal lobe starts to go offline. And in the most extreme cases, this is called amygdala hijack or autonomic overload. We're acting without thinking, okay? So one of the things we are very good at, and I guess we train to, is that we never act without thinking. Our frontal lobe is always engaged. And part of the way we do that is even in those moments, when I was getting ready to jump out of an airplane and I felt the fear bubbling, I'd immediately start thinking about, okay, what are my procedures? What do I need to think about? What do I need to focus on, right? I'm bringing that frontal lobe deliberately back online and starting to step through in a very precise, deliberate way. And this is what anybody can do when they start to feel the fear response. Part of that hesitation might just be because it feels overwhelming, and you can basically chunk it down so it's not as overwhelming and you can actually step into it.
Got it. And I know throughout the book you focus on optimal performance, but I'd love for you just to distinguish between peak performance and optimal performance.
Yeah, peak performance is a term that's thrown around quite a bit. Everybody is chasing peak performance. They want to be peak here, peak there, peak everywhere. And even when I was in the teams, people used to say, well, you Navy SEALs are the ultimate peak performers. But peak performance is not what we think it is. Peak performance is an apex, right? There's only one place you can go from an apex. It's down. The other thing about peak performance is that it often has to be planned for and scheduled and prepared for, right? The pro football player plans and schedules his entire week so that he can peak for 3 hours on Sunday. All right, so I used to say we're actually optimal performers. Optimal performance means I'm going to do the very best in the moment, whatever the best looks like in that moment. Okay, now that means that sometimes our best looks like peak, and it's flow states and everything's clicking and everything's groovy and cool. Sometimes our best in the moment, though, is I am just head down, just nugging it out, going step by step, because that's all I have right now, right? That is still performing optimally. And what it allows us to do is a couple things. First, it allows us to celebrate those times when we're not at peak, because we can't be at peak all the time, right? I can't tell you, I did hundreds of combat missions. I can't tell you how many we come back from and be like, man, that was ugly, right? But we still got the job done, right? That was performing optimally. We did the best we could in the moment. The other thing it allows us to do, which is a little bit more important probably, is it allows us to do what I call responsible energy management. In other words, I don't have to be peak when I'm driving to the grocery store. I can be some other energy level. A myth I'll bust about Navy SEALs is you might see it in TV and movies, a group of SEALs getting ready to go out on a mission, and right before they go, they're all collecting, and they get to a group and they're hoo-yawing and they're high-fiving and they're doing all this stuff. That never happens, okay? We never do that. In fact, most of the times we'd be in the helicopter flying into combat, and the guys around me would be napping. They'd be asleep. And there's a reason. It's because we don't know what's coming. We don't know how long we're going to be out there. We don't know what's going to be required energetically. We're not going to waste an ounce of energy doing things we don't need to do, okay? To include worrying about stuff, because worry is a huge energy draw. So optimal performance allows us to think about performance as this umbrella underneath which peak lives and gutting it out lives and even recovery lives, right? It's all encompassing, and we're constantly modulating inside of this idea of optimal performance. And that's why we talk about it that way, because just to talk about peak is very, very limiting.
It's interesting. Like you mentioned this early on in our conversation, and since I did take the assessment, this has been in the back of my mind ever since you said it, where you said that narcissism, they found it as a trait of some of the top like CEOs ever. And this was in like my bottom 5 attributes. So I'm thinking, man, like
Well, I always say CEOs, top entrepreneurs.
Top entrepreneurs,
ever. Yeah.
And like, am I screwed now?
We know that sometimes entrepreneurs make horrible CEOs. Just to let your audience know real quick, narcissism, there's narcissistic personality disorder, which is a true full-blown disorder. And then there's general narcissism, okay? And without getting into the details here, general narcissism is the desire to stand out, be recognized, be adored, be made feel special. And every single human being on this planet wants to, at some point in their lives, stand out, be recognized, be adored, be made feel special, okay? It's a very typical, very normal human desire, okay? So generalized narcissism, we all have some, and generalized narcissism can be the impetus to some very audacious goals. Most guys want to be Navy SEALs because we want to be badasses. We want to stand out. We want to be like, oh, I want to be the best of the best. That's narcissism getting us there, right? We don't stay in the high levels, right? Because our team around us keeps us humble, but it gets us there, or at least it's a driver, right? And so the fact that you're low is not a bad thing, and most people find themselves a little bit lower. And I think the idea is, even if you find yourself low, the question we have to ask ourselves is, okay, I am low, good, cool, but are there places where I should, in fact, seek a little bit more to stand out? Be the best in this, be the best. Or am I, someone who's super low, like too low on narcissism, they're the wallflower. They're the hermit. They never come out of their house. They don't want to be seen. They want to be invisible. That's unhealthy too. And so it's really about understanding these attributes in a non-judgmental way and figuring out what works for us and then metabolizing them in a healthy way. That's really what it's about.
So it's interesting you mentioned that. Do you find that there's stages in our lives or in our careers where certain attributes that are greater drivers than at other periods of time, like the things, for example, the attribute you have that gets you to become a Navy SEAL, and then once you've done that for 20 years, you find that it changes?
I think this is all about attributes being developed or in some cases atrophying, and I think our life experience helps do both, right? And so great example is my empathy. Okay, my empathy, and I think most men can relate to this, is where we start out fairly low on empathy, and then we get married, and then suddenly we feel like, oh shoot, I'm feeling more, and then we have kids, and suddenly we're crying at Pixar movies. So we feel this kind of growth and development. Versus narcissism, a lot of us as younger folks, we have this drive. We want to be the best. We want to do that. And as we get older, it's like, yeah, I don't need to be the best anymore. So it atrophies a little bit, and that's okay. Sometimes we make deliberate effort. I talked to a gentleman, and he was in his 70s, a very successful businessman throughout his whole life, and did the assessment with him. He came up low on competitiveness. And he said, this makes total sense. He said, I used to be so hyper competitive that it was exhausting. And so I made a deliberate decision to start being less competitive, degrade that attribute. And now I'm low on it, and it's just, my life is just so much more balanced, and I don't have to stress out and things like that. And that's a decision he made, right? So I think our experience, our life experience, definitely adds into either development or in some cases atrophy of these things.
On the other side of that, so there was on the top 5 attributes, there was one, I've never actually heard this word before, so I may even pronounce it incorrectly. It's like insouciance. Is that right?
You pronounced it great. That's an interesting one, Michael, because we don't see a lot of folks with high insouciance. Okay, but so insouciance means it's this casual lack of concern or indifference to what others think. What do I mean by that? And the way I was thinking about this is obviously in most of my introspection, I'm thinking about SEALs and how I showed up. That's the person who marches to the beat of their own drummer, and they don't necessarily care what other people think. They do their own thing. Most iconoclasts are those types of people, right? They just I don't care. Now, the low end of that is fear of rejection. Now, I'm low on insouciance. In other words, I'm higher on fear of rejection. What does that mean? That means that I'm someone who, when I look around me, I'm gauging the people around me, and I will actually push myself to do things if the people around me are pushing themselves, because I don't want to look bad, okay? How can both be advantageous? Well, in the SEAL world, if you have a guy like me who doesn't like heights, I hate heights, but I have to jump out of airplanes, I'm going to jump out of that airplane no matter what, because everybody else is, okay? And there's no way I'm looking bad. So that really helps me. On the other hand, the person who doesn't really care, that's the person who'll start movements. They'll be like, hey, I'm gonna do this thing. I don't care what people think. I'm gonna do it. And often people flock to them, okay? So where you fall on this actually doesn't matter. Obviously, too high in any area can be low, and too low in any area. If you're way off the charts in insouciance, you could be a social grenade. You don't care so much that you're a social grenade, right? You can be so low on insouciance that you care so much about what people think, because you could be subject to peer pressure and manipulation, things like that. But most of us are somewhere on the gradient, and we can start to say, where do I lean? You tend to lean towards someone who, you do your own thing. If you have something, you're gonna go do it. You don't really care what other people are doing. You don't care what other people think. And that's generally how you probably do, how you probably operate. Does that resonate with you in that explanation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was reading through the results, like what was in the top 5 and in the bottom 5, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly. And the only one that was concerning in the bottom 5 was persistence. But it's interesting because in the top 5, it's discipline, tenacity, insouciance, perseverance, confidence. And I was like, wait, but I do have a degree of persistence, but I guess it's all relative to the other ones, right?
Well, so listen, so first of all, don't confuse perseverance with persistence, okay? Perseverance is, and I got to see I got your results here, by the way. Your perseverance is pretty good. Perseverance is you get knocked down 7 times, you're going to get up 8, right? I'm going to keep on going no matter what. You're number 4 persevere. You're high perseverance, right? So which means, hey, you're going to keep on going. Tenacity and persistence are different. Persistence is this firm obstinance that the path I'm on, I'm going to keep doing the same thing and it's going to work after time. That's the stonecutter approach. I'm going to tap that stone 100 times in the same place and see nothing. But on the 101st tap, the thing's going to break because I know it's going to work. That's persistence. Tenacity, on the other hand, is I'm going to try something. If it doesn't work, I'm going to immediately shift and try something else. If that doesn't work, I'm going to immediately shift and try something else. Right? So you're higher on tenacity and lower on persistence. You're someone who tends to, if you're trying something and it's not working, you're going to shift approaches pretty rapidly, which is actually a good thing because you have a lot of perseverance. Where could it be a blind spot for you? Well, you're low on patience, okay? Low patience matches with high tenacity, right? Because you have no patience for sticking to the same thing, okay? So where you have to be careful of some blind spots is you may, in some cases, have something that, oh, you know what? I should stick to this a little bit longer. I should stay the course. You might need to find people around you that force you to stay the course because your impatience and your high tenacity are going to be driving you. Hey, let's change. So the idea is you may need to find people who say, no, hold on, let's just stay the course, right? So these are all, again, if we don't judge them. We see your success is based on these things, but we should be cognizant of some blind spots and say, hey, because of this, because of who I am, I may need to be careful about not sticking to the same thing long enough,
yeah.
and changing too rapidly.
So for those that are listening to this podcast, and I'd certainly encourage anyone listening to read the book, go online, take the assessment, but then you get the results and I think it's almost 50 pages. What do you advise is like, what does someone do next, right? Like once they have their results, they read through it and they say, okay, I agree or I disagree, but how do they ultimately use it to improve?
Yeah, I would say look at your top 5, bottom 5, ask yourself some questions about, okay, does this make sense to me? And then how has having these top 5 been advantageous? But also, how has having these 5 been disadvantageous? Do the introspection both ways and do the same thing for the bottom 5. How has having these been disadvantageous and how has having these been advantageous, right? So you're doing a full non-judgmental introspection and then look at the middle ones. The middle ones are kind of like, it means you can flex and flow between the polarities to some degree. But then ask yourself as you look at that, it's okay, when I look at some of these attributes, are there some of these attributes that if I worked on developing would really help me in what I'm doing right now? And those attributes may not be in your bottom 5. They may be in your lower medium or whatever. But do the diligence in saying, hey, how can I develop these? If one of them is your bottom 5, then it'll give you ideas on how to develop. It'll also give you ideas on how to maximize the ones you're high on. But really, it's to do some real introspection, and then I would encourage you to begin to use attributes as your language of performance for yourself and your team. One of the things I love about it is it's all English language, right? I don't even say English; it's all human language because it translates very well too. And again, I don't badmouth any personality assessments. I think most of them are really good and fun. But when I'm told that I'm a yellow-blue, right? It's hard for me to tell you about me being a yellow-blue if you don't know what a yellow-blue is. And by the way, if I haven't looked up what yellow-blue means in a week or two, I'll forget what yellow-blue is. Much easier to say, hey, I'm a little bit lower on adaptability or I'm a little bit lower on patience. That's a conversation you can have with anybody, even someone who's not even familiar with the content. So I would encourage people to start using this as a language of performance because it starts to open up a whole facet of depth in the people around you and especially the people you lead.
And Rich, for the skeptics that are listening, right? Maybe there's one or two. Do you happen to have like an example of, perhaps a leader or an organization that you work with where, it was like before the attributes, things were a mess or maybe things were mediocre. And then by leveraging these insights, they were able to transform?
Yeah, well, in most cases, our most visible changes come with hiring and selection. And so with the work we do with organizations to help them understand what attributes they're looking for and then help them tweak their hiring processes to hire for those specific attributes, we found great success in terms of retention and people who they hire sticking around. In one case, we had a company with I think they had a record of 4 out of 10 were staying, right? In other words, they were losing 6 for every 10. And once they started implementing this and tweaking their systems, they went up to 8. 8 out of 10 were staying and only 2 were leaving. And so that was a huge change. And they had people who were fitting in with the culture and succeeding more rapidly. So they're immediately fitting in and immediately getting up to speed because they're coming in with the attributes that they're required. There was no consternation in the team. And so that's our most visible success, right? The other success is really just, I love the illumination. There's always illumination, and there's an excitement about being able to have these conversations inside of a team organization in a very relatable and human way. That's always a cool drive.
And as we come to a close, this being the Game Changing Attorney podcast, Rich, what does being a game changer mean to you?
Being a game changer means helping people recognize and realize their potential, because potential is always out in front of us. It's always beyond those edges of what we know, edges of comfort zone. And so anything that we can do for the people in our span of care, whether it be personal or professional, to help them stretch and help them achieve or reach potential, or at least, I shouldn't even say reach, but move towards their potential, right? I think is a game changer. And we know that because it can allow folks to do things they never thought they could do.
I want to give a huge thank you to Rich Diviney for taking the time to join us on the Game Changing Attorney podcast. If you found this episode valuable, here are 3 free ways that I can help you grow your law firm. Number 1, download the first chapter of my book absolutely free at GameChangingAttorney.com. Number 2, you can shoot me a text at 404-531-7691 and I'll answer any question that you've got for me. And finally, number 3, if you can leave this podcast a 5-star review, it'll help us gain access to more influential thought leaders and bring their lessons learned here to you. For more information on our interview with Rich Diviney, see the show notes for this episode in your podcast app or visit legalpodcast.com.